Welcome to the Blue White Breakdown presented by Penn Live. Johnny McGonigal here with Max Ralph. We're recording this Wednesday morning, the morning after Penn State finds out that it moves up in the college football playoff rankings. The playoff committee released its rankings on Tuesday night, the dreaded annual in between the Champions Classic college basketball games. So we all have to wait around for the CFP rankings. But Penn State moved up from 6 to number 4, behind Oregon, Ohio State, and Texas. Benefited by Miami and Georgia losing over the weekend and dropping behind the Nittany Lions. Penn State right now projected, if the season ended today, to be the number 6 seed, hosting a first-round playoff game at Beaver Stadium against Ole Miss in a Peach Bowl rematch. So an opportunity for that. A few more weeks left in the season to go, though. Max, we'll start with you before we get into some questions, because this is a mailbag podcast, but a vast majority of the questions were about the CFP and the rankings and where Penn State stands. So just to get your initial thoughts, though, on where Penn State is in the rankings now.
Yeah, I think when you just look at it from when you just look at it on the whole, I think it's a good thing that Penn State moved up to 4. It's kind of what we all expected. I think, like we said last week, this continues to mean Penn State controls its own destiny. Pretty much whatever happens the rest of the way, as long as you win your games, you are hosting a playoff game, which is good. And I also think, even though it's, you would have loved to play in a Big Ten championship, you are getting likely one of the easier paths through the CFP with the way this is going to shake out, getting that 5 or 6 seed, depending on, what happens with Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, etc. So I think that it's a pretty overwhelming positive for Penn State for the committee to still see the Nittany Lions as a top 5 team, despite not really having a great win on the resume, having one loss. I think this is pretty much all you could have asked for. Now, Johnny, I have to say, Champions Classic was fire. I watched the Duke-Kentucky game. It was a really good one. Worthwhile. And the other thing, Ole Miss, I'm here for it because Lane Kiffin got a stray in a James Franklin presser in week 2 or something. He was asked about bulletin board material and how they work around it. And James Franklin didn't specifically mention Lane, but he made a reference to that fake Twitter account that an Ole Miss staffer made at the Peach Bowl last year. I'm here for it. It wouldn't quite be Pat Narduzzi, James Franklin levels of shade, but I think it would be close, and I want to see it.
The pettiness would be like an 8 out of 10. If it ended up being Penn State Pitt in the playoff, which is not going to happen because Pitt has fallen off pretty significantly, losing its last 2 games to SMU and Virginia. That was a pipe dream for a little bit for Pitt fans, but not going to happen. The pettiness levels, though, between James Franklin and Lane Kiffin would be high up there. Now, I don't think for first round games they're going to be doing joint coach press conferences like they would do at a non-playoff New Year's Six game in the past. So you might not get that head-to-head. But I would also love to see Penn State go up against an Ole Miss team that added a lot in the transfer portal, but also still has Jackson Dart, still has Trey Harris, still has Prieskorn at tight end, guys who cooked Penn State's defense in the Peach Bowl, but a Penn State defense that we all know is not the same that what it was throughout the season, and then also what they are last year with the number of opt-outs and everything else that went into that game. So would be highly interested in that matchup. But like you mentioned, Max, I think Penn State right now in a really good spot. Again, win out, beat Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland, and you're all but, you're guaranteed, I think at this point, a home playoff game, and likely, or possibly at least, considering where they are in the rankings right now, that 5 or 6 seed, which means that if you win your first round game, you're probably playing the ACC champ or the Big 12 champ in the quarterfinals and missing the SEC champ or Big 10 champ. So I think that's a really valuable spot, that 5 or 6, and Penn State's in solid position to get there right now. Let's get to some questions, Max, unless you have anything else to add on that.
No, I was just the only thing that I was going to say is I'm really interested to see how this goes for a lot of reasons. I mean, obviously, first year of the 12 team playoff, we don't necessarily know how it's going to go, period. But I think that that situation with being the 5 and 6 seed is one of the most interesting ones because everybody wants to win a conference championship. We had that whole mailbag pod, I think on the bye week where we addressed this. Like, yeah, you want to win your conference, but it might arguably be a better situation to finish as the 5 or 6 seed. And like that could be, I'm not going to say that that would be a problem because nobody's going to go into the season being like, oh, we're going to intentionally lose one game. Like I just think it's interesting. Like it might in the future end up meaning that we get a change in the way we do seeding. But I don't know. I just think it's going to be really fun to watch this first year of the 12 team playoff.
Yeah, I look, we'll see how it plays out. I still disagree with the thought that you're better off being the 5 or 6 seed as opposed to winning the Big Ten. Uh,
Right.
I still
Me
disagree with
too.
that. I think you do too. Yeah, but we have some interesting questions. So talking about resume, talking about what the committee considers, and then even just Penn State's path right now, the final 3 games as it relates to the college football playoff. Um, First question off the top is from Mike Wrights. After reading for Tom Fornelli's piece in CBS Sports, I am once again irked. Sounds like he is an SEC homer rooting for a Minnesota upset against Penn State. But he did comment on how there are no Big Ten teams ranked outside the top 4. Long term, that is a huge problem for the Big Ten, anomaly or chronic. Now, Max, I don't know if you read it, but Tom Fornelli, who works for CBS Sports, did a column about basically a doomsday scenario for the Big Ten. Talking about how beyond the top 4 teams, Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, and Indiana, there are no teams in the rankings, and he basically argued that he'd rather be the SEC that has, I think, 9 teams ranked in the top 16, and how a loss to Minnesota, for Penn State could ultimately kick them out. I think right now Penn State has a 60% chance of winning out, an 80% chance of getting in, according to ESPN's projections. But obviously, a loss to Minnesota makes things dicey there. In terms of the SEC homer bit of it, I didn't read it that way. I know Fornelli. I think he's an Illinois grad and a big Big Ten guy. So I wouldn't read it that way. But interested, Max, what you think on
Yeah.
just in terms of it. Is it a problem or is it not that Penn State or excuse me that the Big Ten has 4 of the top 5 teams in the rankings, but no one else?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a problem. I think that if you want to be honest about this, I think this was fairly expected this year, minus the fact that Indiana is one of those top 5 teams. But like, I don't think the Big Ten was ever expected to be, 8 teams in the top 25 this year. I just don't think it was because you probably would have guessed Michigan ended up somewhere in the top 25. Obviously, that team's fallen off, but if you do a 1-to-1 trade with Indiana, that's pretty much where you're at. Lincoln Riley's leash is short at USC. That program will eventually, we think, especially now that it's in the Big Ten, figure its stuff out and become a perennial power like it has been. They're always going to attract talent in LA. Like, that's just the bottom line. They just need to figure out the administrative side of it, which is, I think, probably coming soon. That's one. Washington, pretty perennial top 5 team for the last 10, 15 years, I guess, especially under Kalen DeBoer before he left. Jed Fish is working with scraps right now. And you got to give him credit for the fact that he's even won 5 games this year. I mean, if you really want to go back and look at everyone they lost from last season's team, it's honestly pretty impressive that they've won 5 games in the Big Ten. Like, to be completely honest with you, he did a great job at Arizona. I think he's going to figure it out there. Michigan, you have to assume they'll be back eventually. Didn't have the quarterback this year. That played a huge part. So I guess back to my original point, I don't think it's surprising that the Big Ten is in this position. Because I think really when you sit and objectively say, if you're in the preseason, you say, all right, 4 Big 10 teams are going to be in the top 5, but nobody else is going to be ranked. I don't think that really surprises anybody because as it's been for a long time, the Big Ten is top heavy and it's going to remain that way. Iowa is going to fight here and there to be in the top 25 and maybe one day get into the playoff. Michigan State, depending on what happens with Jonathan Smith. But if you're talking preseason, I don't think that this catches anybody by surprise. And I don't think it's a long-term problem because I think you're in such a transition phase with a lot of these programs that could be contending in the future.
Agree wholeheartedly, Max. Don't think it's a long term issue necessarily. Agree with your points. I mean, there was always going to be a national title game hangover for both Michigan and Washington, with Kalen DeBoer going to Alabama, as well as Penix, Odunze, McMillan, Polk, all those guys for Washington going to the NFL. We kind of
Yeah.
figured that Washington was going to be a shell of its former self. Same with Michigan losing Jim Harbaugh and a bevy of NFL draft picks after winning the national title. Michigan will, between their NIL support, their recruiting, what their success over the last 5 to 6 years in Big Ten play, they'll be back.
Yeah.
I don't think Penn State fans would like that, but I think they will be back and certainly better than they are this year. I agree with your point on USC. Another thing to mention here, this is the first year with no divisions in the Big Ten, which I think is affecting the former Big Ten West teams. Iowa,
Yeah.
Wisconsin, teams that in typical years, in the last 10 or so years, would be beating up on teams from the Big Ten West. Yeah, you get that crossover game from the Big Ten East, but those teams that would normally be sitting here at 7-2 are now 6-3 or whatever. So I think that is playing a part here in terms of not having top 25 teams. Over the last 5 years, it always seemed like Iowa was in that like 18 to 22 range, right, in the rankings and
Yeah.
bolstering the Big Ten a little bit. And so I think that plays a factor as well. So good question though from Mike. Appreciate it. Moving to another question about the CFP, and this is from Brian G, and more specific to Penn State. How can you have a statement win against a Purdue, a Maryland, a Minnesota? Would blowouts constitute a statement win? Would blowouts make a case to the selection committee for a higher seeding over, let's say, a one-loss Tennessee or Notre Dame or Miami? My initial take on this, looking at those 3 teams that Brian mentioned, if you've got a one-loss Tennessee, that means they just beat Georgia this weekend, and Tennessee is going to jump Penn State. Like if Tennessee wins this weekend, I think they probably jump to 4, and that would be understandable. I know they have the loss to Arkansas, but then they would have wins over Georgia and Alabama. If Tennessee wins this weekend, I think they'll be ahead of Penn State. But if everything else holds serve and Penn State wins out, obviously you want to win convincingly. But 11-1 speaks for itself. And what does Notre Dame have ahead of itself? It has Army and USC. Like Penn State already beat USC. Maybe if Notre Dame beats them by a billion, maybe that changes things a little bit. Miami doesn't really factor into this because I feel like where they are now at the 9 seed, or excuse me, the number 9 ranking, they're either going to win the ACC and get in with a bye, or they're probably going to be out. There might be a little bit of wiggle room that they could lose close to SMU in the ACC title game and stay in. But for Penn State's purposes, I don't think Miami factors in here. Max, what say you in terms of what Penn State has ahead of itself and what it can do to maybe impress the committee over these final 3 weeks?
Yeah, I think, like I said toward the top of the podcast here, the committee has already shown that Penn State being in that 4 spot means as long as you win out, you're going to be fine. You're going to be that 5 or 6 seed. I really think that's plain and simple. Like if the committee thought Penn State still needed to show something, Penn State would not be number 4 right now, is basically the way that I look at this. Like they've clearly done enough in the committee's opinion. So moving down the stretch, Tennessee is like the one team I'd say that can come in and kind of shake things up. Because I mean, unless IU beats Ohio State, in which case IU is going to a Big Ten championship game. I'm really excited to see that game. Number one, number two, I don't think Indiana would beat Ohio State, but if they did, that can shake things up. I think BYU, even if they're a conference champion, is probably finishing behind, at least two teams from the Big Ten or SEC. Tennessee, though, if they do end up 11-1 in the regular season, you're talking about an SEC championship game and the potential to beat Texas and take one of those top seeds. So then we're still, Penn State is still in the conversation for that 5 or 6 seed. So there's a lot of different ways that it can still go at the end of this in terms of, if anybody jumps Penn State, there's a couple teams that could do it. But I think the bottom line is that you have to remind yourself every time you're talking about Penn State and the college football playoff right now, the committee has seen Penn State not score an offensive touchdown against Ohio State and still put them fourth ahead of all these other teams that we're like worried about. Don't be worried. Like, yeah, there's a couple ways that teams could jump Penn State, but as long as they went out, almost regardless of fashion, you can't beat Purdue by one score, but I don't think that's going to happen. Nittany Lions are going to be good.
One other team to add into the mix in terms of a team that could jump up from its spot right now, potentially win its conference, and then knock out a team that is currently higher than Penn State and push Penn State down a spot or two. And I know that was a lot, but Texas A&M, right now they're number 15, but one of their 2 losses is to Notre Dame in the non-conference. They control their own destiny going the rest of the way. They play Texas. So if they were to win out and beat Texas, they would go into the SEC championship game. And, if Texas lost that game close, I feel like they might have Texas still above Penn State, but just something to consider. Again, we've got 3 more weeks of games here. A lot's going to be fleshed out over, this closing home stretch. But again, Penn State in a really good spot.
Let me just say,
yeah,
the SEC is a mess.
It's a mess, which if you're a Penn State fan, you kind of want it to be status quo, except for this weekend, I think. You know what? I was going to say you're rooting for Georgia this weekend over Tennessee, but if Penn State were to lose another game, and Georgia beats Tennessee, and you've got Georgia at 2 losses, Tennessee at 2 losses, and say Texas A&M beats Texas, and you've got Texas and Texas A&M, like there's an opportunity for like 5 or 6 SEC teams to have 2 losses, and then if Penn State loses at Minnesota, say, how does their resume stack up? So I think that's really the concern for Penn State is if you lose another game, but again, just win out and you're fine. Yeah.
There's also the added wrinkle that we don't know if Nico Yamaleava is going to play against Georgia this weekend. How does the committee take that into account? Like, if Tennessee loses without its starting quarterback, the Vols are probably still a top 10 team. If I was on that committee, you gotta factor it in. They certainly did not feel that way about, or did rather feel that way about Florida State last year and keeping the Noles out of the playoff because Jordan Travis was hurt. So, I mean, that doesn't necessarily affect Penn State in the long run. Although another Georgia win could push them toward the top, and then it gets shaky with whoever's in that SEC championship game and could end up pushing PSU down a little bit. But I still think, even in that doomsday scenario, Penn State is a top 8 seed. They're still hosting a playoff game.
Yeah, it would just be a matter of who they would play and then what that next matchup would be. But something to keep a close eye on. It's kind of hard to sift through rooting interests this weekend, knowing that other games are going to be coming up that could also affect things whichever way those outcomes go over the next 2 weeks. But it's hard to sift through. It's hard for us to sift through. So if you're a listener and you're like, okay, who should I root for this weekend? I understand. Like it's difficult. A question from Jeff High, who is a frequent contributor to our mailbag podcast. How will the CFP committee consider factors like intra-conference matchups, geography, travel, if at all, when making the bracket? And I guess my thing is like everyone travels now. I know it's a little bit different in the SEC where everything's down there, but and the Big Ten, you had Penn State going out to USC, um,
Hmm.
Ohio State going out to Oregon. I haven't heard. I've been on both teleconferences with the CFP chair Ward Manuel, and unless my phone cut out for a question, I didn't hear him asked about travel or that specifically. So I'm not sure, personally, if that is a factor. But I will say, like, I think with these expanded conferences, I mean, SMU playing in the ACC, for example. Like, I mean, Stanford, I know that they're not in the mix, but Stanford and Cal being in the ACC and how ridiculous that seems. Like, all these
Hmm.
conferences are traveling more now this year than they were last. So I wouldn't think it's a big deal. I still think the core bit of it is how you look, who you play, your strength of record. And I do think that they're giving value to non conference scheduling, which has always been a back and forth. It's like, okay, should we schedule light in the non conference and just have a better record? Or should we test ourselves and get a marquee win? Because, the first thing, last week when talking to the CFP chair, when asked about Penn State, one of the first things he brought up was the win over West Virginia, which West Virginia is not a great team. I think they're 5-4 right now, but the fact that
Yeah,
Penn State
they're
decided like we're
very
going to
beat
go
up.
down to Morgantown and play in a hostile environment, I think that does carry some weight. So I think what carried weight in previous years still does. And in terms of the travel, I'm not sure that that's a big factor, but maybe we'll find out more in the next week or two.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there. If the question was, I might have interpreted the question a little bit differently or incorrectly at that. But if the question has anything to do with like traveling with seating, like having a BYU play at Penn State, that's not going to happen because of the way things are shaking out. But those were just the two teams that were farthest away that I looked at quickly. Like I don't think that that's a factor at all, because I mean there's extra time in the off season to plan your travel. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're not playing in a conference championship, you have multiple weeks between a potential home playoff game um, and traveling. Sorry, I said that wrong, but you get the point. And nobody who is playing in a conference championship game, presumably this season, will be traveling to a road playoff game this year, unless maybe one of the SEC teams. But either way, like I don't think the committee, and like I said, I might have interpreted the question wrong, but
No,
the committee is not making matchups like making dream matchups when they rank these teams. They're like I think they're doing it by who's the best teams.
I think you read the question correctly, and I misinterpreted it. I think that's how it was posited
Okay.
because, yeah. So I agree with you what you said. One other thing to add, I think if anything, if we're talking about avoiding something for the committee, I think they would like to probably avoid rematches in the regular season. I don't think anyone really
Hmm.
needs to see that in the first round, at least. Like, I'm not saying that they would
Yeah.
mess with the seedings to set up a rematch or not set up a rematch in the second round or in the semifinals. But I think in the first round, uh, they would like to see unique matchups because this is the first year. This is the first year of the 12-team playoff, and we might get a rematch in the SEC if things get really muddy in the first round. But I don't think Penn State would see a rematch. In the first round, just given its schedule, because
Yeah.
Ohio State would really be the only one that's in contention there. Um, Speaking of the Big Ten and Ohio State, a team that they're going to play next week, the story of the season, a quote unquote nice story, as Thomas McConkey called it, Indiana. He said, looking at the schedule, quite easy to see why they're undefeated. No Penn State, no Oregon, USC, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin. Like, he just rattled off a bunch of teams that Indiana has not played this year. and called them pretenders. Or he was saying the teams that they played were pretenders, but I think he's calling Indiana pretenders. Which
Interesting.
Max, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they have played a weaker strength of schedule. They've avoided the Big Ten powers. Of course, a win against Michigan, which the Wolverines played them really tough. I mean, you could say whatever you want about Michigan this year. Played a good game against Indiana on the road. They've played an easier schedule, but I just think outside of that Michigan game, the reason why I'm maybe not a believer that they could win a national championship, but a believer that Indiana is deserving of its seeding and of probably making a playoff is the fashion with which they've beaten all these teams. It was not until like week 8 that they had ever trailed in a game this season. And that includes a game in which their backup quarterback played the entire game. Like, they are just crushing teams. Crushing teams. They're really freaking good. I mean, obviously there's a big drop off in the lower half of the Big Ten. They've played a lot of those teams, but give James Franklin credit for saying it all the time. You got to enjoy winning, and you can only play the teams that are on your schedule. So if you're blowing them out week after week, that's all you can do. And so, like, Indiana didn't make this schedule. The Big Ten made it. So they're 10-0 with the schedule they've been given. Not only that, but they're blowing teams out. They deserve to be maybe not higher than Penn State. I think that 5 is a good spot for Indiana. But if they were to just have one loss against Ohio State this year and not make it in, I think that's a travesty.
If their only loss is to Ohio State and it's relatively close, I'm saying say they lose by 14, 17
Yeah.
even, and that's their only loss, they should be in the field. Now, do I think Indiana can win the national title? I don't think so. And I love what they've done this year. And that's not me calling them a pretender necessarily, because I think they are a damn good team. And like you mentioned, Max, I mean, going into that Michigan game, they had beaten everyone on their schedule by at least 14 points. Now, their non-conference schedule included Florida International, Western Illinois, and Charlotte. So not good. But, when you have a first-year head coach, like, and those games are made well in advance, and you're Indiana, like, yeah, in the non-conference, why would you make it harder on yourself to pick up wins when typically Indiana is just fighting for bowl eligibility, not for a spot in the college football playoff or to contend for the national championship? So I don't blame them for their non-conference schedule. I certainly don't blame them for their conference schedule. That's just the way it worked out. But I think in the Michigan game, it was the first time all year they saw NFL caliber dudes in the trenches. Both on, Michigan's offensive line isn't as good as it has been in years past, but you look at the defensive line that Michigan had, and Josiah Stewart, Mason Graham, like guys who are first round talents, and they mucked it up. They really they made it difficult on Indiana, and credit to them for persevering and winning. And the CFP chair, Ward Manuel, who just happens to be the Michigan's athletic director, gave credit to Indiana for a really big win. They didn't cover. They were 15, 14-point favorites, and they won by 5. So, but yeah, I don't think Indiana has it like up front and everything to win the national title. But I also think that if they were to lose respectably to Ohio State, they deserve to be in the field.
Yep, I'm with you.
Awesome. Last question, and this was not a CFP question, the quick hitter for us. There was no name on the question, but it just says status of Quentin Martin, reason he hasn't played for several games. You want to take this, Max?
Sure. Number one, he's dealt with an undisclosed injury until this past week. I think he missed 2 straight weeks, if I'm remembering correctly. He was ruled out and going through some warm-ups on the field, but wasn't ready to play. He'd missed some practice. But yeah, back healthy this weekend. However, you might not see him for a while still in the regular season because he's played in 3 games. He can only play in 4 before he redshirts. this has kind of been the plan all along too, is to have both him and Corey Smith preserve their red shirts. That was, I mean, just bottom line, that's been the plan all season. James Franklin has been pretty transparent about it. It was a little different when they had Cam Wallace as the number 3 running back. They thought that it would be easy to keep the red shirts for Quentin and Corey. Not so much when Cam got hurt, because Quentin ended up having to play. Not only did Cam get hurt, but Nick Singleton was hurt against UCLA too. So, Quentin was the one who was ready a little bit sooner than Corey. But as you saw against Washington, Corey had a really nice run. They think he's, physically, he's still got some developing to do, but they think technique-wise, learning the scheme, being able to mix it up as a runner, they think he's ready. So you're probably going to see more Corey Smith late in games to end this year out than you will Quentin Martin. Corey Smith can play in all 3 of these final games. Quentin Martin can only play in one of them because postseason doesn't matter for your red shirt. But that's why Quentin's been hurt. They also want to save his red shirt. That's that.
You just about covered it, Max. I think one thing to add is just keeping tabs on Nick Singleton's availability. James Franklin on Monday called what he suffered against Washington a short-term injury. He's also, like you mentioned, he missed the UCLA game. He's dealt with some bumps and bruises throughout the year, seemingly unrelated to what he picked up at Washington. And so if you go into Purdue and say you don't have Nick Singleton available and it's just Katron Allen, Corey Smith, and then Quentin Martin as your third guy, kind of breaking case of emergency, I wouldn't be surprised if you're going to use Quentin in one of 3 of these final games in the regular season, that it might be Purdue if Nick Singleton cannot go. So just something to keep in mind. And again, we're recording this on Wednesday morning. Max, you'll be at practice tonight. So you'll be there at the Lash Building to see, during the very brief, media window that we have, that you'll be able to see whether or not Nick Singleton is out there going through practice. And even if he's not, that's not necessarily a harbinger of, ill will that he's not going to play in the game. So just something to keep an eye on, something to keep tabs on as we progress throughout this week. Max, anything else to add? Any closing thoughts before we wrap up this mailbag podcast?
No, I think the Penn State fans had good questions this week. I like talking big picture about the Big Ten. I think Penn State's in a great spot on the CFP terms right now, and they went out. Should be an exciting postseason.
Looking forward to it. We'll see if they can improve their record this weekend at Purdue. We all expect them to. I know you and Bob will be back on the podcast feed later this week with a preview of that game, looking ahead to Penn State's trip to West Lafayette. But signing off from this mailbag podcast, again, we're going to keep doing these. A lot of fun. We enjoy it. So when we throw out that prompt, send us your questions. We'll keep doing these week by week. But signing off for the Blue White Breakdown presented by Penn Live, Johnny McGonigal, Max Ralph. Take it easy, folks.